In 1971, one factory on Valencia Street in San Francisco helped produce over 250 million pairs of jeans a year, clothing 1 in 3 American men, selling 501s for $6.50, stitched by 3,000 union workers earning solid middle-class wages. But in 2002, CEO Philip Marineau decided that saving 50 cents per pair mattered more than where those jeans were made. What followed wasn't just outsourcing, it was the collapse of a century-old advantage, the flooding of counterfeits, and the erasure of a workforce that built American denim by hand. This is the story of how the jeans that built San Francisco were undone by the decision that sent them to China, and what it reveals about when efficiency becomes fatal: gold, canvas, and a problem that wouldn't tear. In 1853, a Bavarian immigrant named Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco with dry goods, not a clothing empire in mind. He was 24 years old. He carried wholesale fabric, thread, and scissors across the Panama Isthmus because the transcontinental railroad didn't exist yet. The journey took 6 weeks. Strauss came from Butenheim, a Bavarian village of 2,000 people, where his father Hirsch had sold bolts of cloth door to door. When Hirsch died in 1845, Levi's brothers Jonas and Louis immigrated to New York and started a wholesale business, J. Strauss, Brother and Company. They sent the youngest Strauss west because San Francisco was drowning in gold and bleeding through trousers. The gold rush had transformed a settlement of 1,000 into a chaotic port city approaching 35,000 by 1853. Ships abandoned in the harbor, crews jumping to mining camps, rotted into piers. Entire neighborhoods rose in weeks. Fortunes appeared and vanished daily. This wasn't civilization, it was extraction, and extraction destroyed clothing. Miners worked claims 12 hours daily, crouching in freezing water, shoveling gravel, hauling equipment that weighed more than they did. Canvas tents, shovels, pans, picks, rope. Clothing was just another tool, and it failed constantly. The average miner earned roughly $4 per day when he found color, which was maybe 3 days out of 7. A decent pair of work pants cost $1.50. They lasted 6 weeks if you were careful. Do the math. Every miner spent a quarter of his gross income just keeping his legs covered. Strauss didn't see a fashion opportunity. He saw volume. He set up shop at 90 Sacramento Street, a narrow commercial building 3 blocks from the waterfront. His inventory: canvas for tents and wagon covers, needles, buttons, bolts of wool, and cotton. He wasn't manufacturing anything. He was a middleman connecting East Coast textile mills to Western prospectors who would pay triple the New York price because no one else had made the trip. His first-year revenue probably didn't crack $10,000. Survival, not dominance. But Strauss paid attention. He walked the docks. He listened to miners complaining in boarding houses. He heard the same problem. Pants that ripped at the pockets, tore at the seams, shredded at the knees. Not from wear, from pressure, crouching, lifting, climbing. Gold mining wasn't sedentary labor. The human body in motion shredded cotton. Here's what separated Strauss from 100 other dry goods merchants. He understood the problem wasn't durability alone, it was replacement cost. If you're a miner 3 weeks from the nearest town, a ripped pair of pants doesn't just inconvenience you, it threatens your ability to work. You can't dig in shredded cloth. You lose days traveling back to buy replacements, days you're not earning. That calculation changed everything. Strauss started experimenting. He sold miners canvas pants, the same brown material meant for tents. Heavy, stiff, uncomfortable as hell. But they didn't tear. Miners hated wearing them. They bought them anyway. By 1860, Strauss's business was grossing roughly $30,000 annually. Not remarkable. He still wasn't manufacturing. He was importing and reselling. But he'd identified a customer base that would tolerate discomfort for durability and would pay a premium for it. That insight, that a certain kind of worker values indestructibility over comfort, would define the company for the next century. Strauss himself remained cautious. He didn't expand aggressively. He didn't open branches. He saved profits, reinvested minimally, avoided debt. This wasn't visionary entrepreneurship. This was immigrant pragmatism. His father had died broke. His brothers had clawed their way into the New York wholesale market through brutal competition. Levi Strauss watched San Francisco burn to the ground 6 times between 1849 and 1851. Entire commercial districts reduced to ash in hours. Fortunes built on speculation evaporated. He preferred slow accumulation to risky growth, which is why what happened next mattered so much. In 1872, Strauss received a letter from Reno, Nevada. The sender was Jacob Davis, a Latvian Jewish tailor who'd been buying bolts of canvas and denim from Strauss's San Francisco warehouse to make work pants for miners and railroad laborers. Davis had figured something out, but he didn't have the $68 required to file a patent, and he was terrified someone would steal his idea before he could protect it. What Davis had discovered would change everything, not because it was complicated, because it solved the problem that mattered most. Strauss read the letter twice. Then he made the decision that built an empire. The rivet that changed everything. In 1873, tailor Jacob Davis solved a durability problem with a 5-cent copper rivet. The innovation wasn't glamorous. Davis ran a small tailoring shop at 212 Virginia Street in Reno, Nevada, making work clothes for miners, rail workers, and teamsters hauling ore from the Comstock lode. He charged $3 per pair of reinforced canvas pants, double the rate for ordinary trousers, because his customers would pay extra for anything that lasted longer than 2 months. They weren't buying fashion. They were buying survival equipment. Davis was 43 years old. He'd immigrated from Riga in 1854, worked as a laborer in Maine, tried tailoring in Canada, and drifted west chasing contracts. By 1870, he was making maybe $1,200 annually in Reno. Comfortable, not wealthy. He bought his canvas and denim in bulk from Levi Strauss and Company in San Francisco because Strauss gave him credit and reliable material. Davis wasn't an inventor. He was a craftsman solving the same problem in his shop that Strauss had been circling for 20 years. Pockets ripped under weight. The breakthrough came from a customer, a woodcutter's wife who needed pants that could hold an axe, knife, and tobacco pouch without tearing apart. Davis tried triple stitching the pockets. Lasted a week. He tried leather reinforcement. Too expensive. Then he looked at the copper rivets he used to attach straps to horse blankets. 5 cents per rivet, 10 rivets per pair of pants, hammered into every stress point, pocket corners, base of the fly, belt loops, 50 cents in material, but the pants stopped ripping. Davis tested them on himself, wore them for 2 weeks straight doing heavy labor. The fabric wore thin eventually, but the seams held. He made a pair for the woodcutter, then for a blacksmith, then for a rail gang foreman who ordered 15 pairs for his crew. Word spread through Reno's labor networks, taverns, boarding houses, its job sites. Within 6 months, Davis was making 70 to 90 pairs weekly, all spoken for before completion. But he had a problem. The riveted pants were obviously superior. Anyone with eyes could see the design. Davis had no way to stop every tailor in Nevada from hammering copper rivets into their own pants and undercutting his prices. He needed a patent. But the $68 filing fee plus attorney costs, roughly $1,500 in today's money, was more than Davis could spare. His business was profitable but capital light. He lived week to week. So in December 1872, Davis wrote to Levi Strauss with a proposition. "I'll share the patent rights if you pay the filing costs and help me scale production." Davis knew Strauss had capital, distribution, and credibility. Strauss knew Davis had solved the problem they'd both been chasing. Strauss said yes within a week. On May 20th, 1873, the U.S. Patent Office granted patent number 139,121 to Davis and Strauss, jointly for improvement in fastening pocket openings. The patent described a process for using metal rivets to reinforce seams and pockets in work garments. It cost them $68 to file. It would generate hundreds of millions in revenue over the next 140 years. Strauss immediately brought Davis to San Francisco and set him up in a small factory at 14 to 16 Battery Street. Initial production, maybe 200 pairs weekly. Davis supervised cutting and assembly. Strauss handled materials, financing, and sales. They called them waist overalls. The word jeans wouldn't become standard for another 30 years. They sold for $3.50 per pair wholesale, $6 retail, made from brown cotton duck or blue denim, a sturdy cotton twill fabric dyed with indigo that Strauss imported from Amiskeg Mills in Manchester, New Hampshire. The target customer remained the same, men who needed clothing that wouldn't fail during physical labor, rail workers laying track through the Sierra Nevada, loggers in the redwood forests, stevedores on the San Francisco docks, ranchers in California's Central Valley. These weren't consumers browsing for style. They were workers calculating whether their equipment could survive their jobs. And here's what mattered. Riveted pants became a signal. When you saw a man wearing Levi's waist overalls, you knew he did real work. The rivets weren't decoration. They were proof the garment was built to withstand force. That distinction between fashion and function gave the product credibility that advertising couldn't manufacture. By 1875, Davis and Strauss were producing roughly 600 pairs weekly from the Battery Street facility. By 1880, they were approaching 2,000 pairs weekly and had moved to a larger factory at Fremont and Market Streets. Revenue that year hit approximately $75,000. Still small by national standards, still regional. But the foundation was set. A patented design, a reputation for durability, and a customer base that measured value in lifespan, not appearance. Neither Davis nor Strauss talked about building a fashion empire. They talked about solving a worker's problem better than anyone else. That clarity, knowing exactly who needed what and why, would carry the company for decades, until the day it wouldn't. By 1890, with the patent expired and competitors flooding the market, Levi Strauss and Company faced a new challenge, staying distinctive when anyone could rivet pants. What they did next would transform work clothing into American identity. From workwear to American uniform. By 1900, Levi's pants were no longer a tool. They were a symbol worn coast to coast. But that transformation wasn't planned. It was the accidental consequence of geographic expansion meeting cultural myth. at a moment when America was deciding what it meant to look American. When the rivet patent expired in 1890, Levi Strauss faced immediate competition. Within 18 months, at least a dozen manufacturers were producing riveted work pants: Can't Bust 'em, Carhartt, Sweet'Or, Lee, and others. Most sold for $1.25 to $1.75 wholesale, undercutting Levi's $2.50 price by a third. Simple economics suggested Strauss would lose market share, compress margins, or both. Instead, revenue grew from roughly $300,000 in 1890 to over $3 million by 1910, a tenfold increase in 20 years. What changed wasn't the product. The 501 design, buttonfly, 5 pockets, copper rivets, arcuate stitching on the back pockets, remained essentially identical to the 1873 patent. What changed was where the pants went and who wore them there. The first expansion vector was the railroad. By 1890, the transcontinental network employed over 750,000 workers: track layers, maintenance crews, engineers, brakemen. They worked outdoors, often hundreds of miles from supply depots, in conditions that destroyed ordinary clothing. Railroad companies didn't mandate specific brands, but foremen noticed durability differences. Levi's pants survived longer. That meant fewer replacement orders, less downtime, lower costs. It's a word spread through crew networks. By 1895, Levi Strauss & Company had distribution contracts with railroad supply companies from Omaha to El Paso. The second vector was ranching. The open-range cattle industry exploded after the Civil War. Texas herds driven north to railheads in Kansas, Wyoming, Montana. Cowboys needed clothing that could withstand 12-hour days in the saddle, rope work, and weather extremes. Levi's waist overalls became standard gear not because of advertising. The company barely advertised, but because drovers saw what other drovers wore and copied what worked. By 1900, cattle ranching from Montana to Arizona created a visual language: wide-brimmed hat, leather boots, blue denim pants. Levi's didn't create that image. They supplied it. The third vector was military labor. During World War I, the U.S. military contracted civilian clothing for Quartermaster Corps, supply units, and stateside industrial workers supporting the war effort. Levi Strauss & Company supplied work pants to shipyards, munitions factories, and military construction projects. Between 1917 and 1918, the company produced over 2 million pairs annually, triple their peacetime output. Suddenly, men from Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Michigan who'd never owned a pair of riveted pants wore them daily. When they returned home after the war, they kept buying them. What Levi Strauss understood, though they never articulated it explicitly, was that function creates trust faster than marketing creates desire. Their pants worked. That's all the endorsement they needed. But something deeper was happening. The pants were becoming embedded in American mythology in ways the company couldn't control and didn't fully recognize. Cowboys weren't just workers. They were symbols of independence and rugged masculinity in a culture rapidly urbanizing. Railroad men represented progress and expansion. Soldiers represented sacrifice and strength. All of them wore blue denim. The pants absorbed those associations. By 1910, Levi Strauss & Company operated wholesale distribution centers in Seattle, Portland, Salt Lake City, and Denver. They employed roughly 500 factory workers in San Francisco, producing 60,000 to 80,000 pairs weekly. Annual revenue approached $4 million. Retail price held steady at $5.50 to $6.50, depending on style. Premium pricing justified by reputation, not marketing campaigns. The company's leadership remained conservative. After Levi Strauss died in 1902, control passed to his nephews, Jacob, Sigmund, Louis, and Abraham Stern, who continued the founder's cautious approach. They reinvested profits slowly, avoided debt, and expanded only when demand clearly justified new capacity. They didn't hire Madison Avenue advertisers or commission brand studies. They made pants for people who destroyed pants. And here's the advantage they built without recognizing it: authenticity. In 1915, if you wore Levi's, you either did hard labor or wanted to look like someone who did. There was no middle market. The pants signaled something real. That signal, built on 2 decades of functional reliability, couldn't be manufactured through advertising. Competitors could copy the rivets, the stitching, even the blue denim. But they couldn't copy the accumulated trust. That trust would carry the company through the Depression, World War II, and the post-war boom. It would make Levi's the default choice for 3 generations of American workers. It would turn 501s into a cultural uniform that transcended class and geography. Until the day someone decided that manufacturing location didn't matter, that the story behind the product was less important than the margin per unit. That place could be separated from product without consequence. But in 1920, that decision was still 80 years away, and in San Francisco, Levi Strauss & Company was about to build something that seemed permanent. A factory complex so large, so efficient, and so central to the city's economy that its disappearance would be unimaginable. The Valencia Street machine. In the 1920s, Levi Strauss built not just a factory, but an economic engine spanning multiple city blocks. The decision to construct the Valencia Street complex came in 1922, driven by a problem the company had never faced. They couldn't keep up with demand. Wholesale orders were backlogged 6 weeks. Retailers from Chicago to Dallas were calling daily, asking when shipments would arrive. The company's scattered facilities, 6 different buildings spread across south of Market, couldn't produce fast enough. They needed consolidation. They needed scale. So the Stern family, now in full control after Levi Strauss's death, purchased an entire city block at 250 Valencia Street in the Mission District. The plot measured 275 feet by 275 feet. Construction began in March 1923. Total investment, approximately $850,000, roughly $15 million in today's dollars. For a private, the debt-averse company that had never borrowed against future earnings, this was an extraordinary bet. The main building rose 8 stories, red brick with steel frame construction, 3,200 windows providing natural light to every work floor. It opened in November 1923. Initial capacity, 25,000 pairs of jeans weekly. Initial workforce, 850 employees, mostly women, mostly immigrants, Italian, Irish, Chinese, Mexican. Starting wage, $18 per week for experienced seamstresses, $12 for entry-level cutters. That was $936 annually at a time when the median household income in San Francisco hovered around $1,200. Not wealthy, but stable. The Valencia Street factory wasn't just large. It was vertically integrated in ways that gave Levi's complete control over quality and speed. Most clothing manufacturers in the 1920s outsourced cutting, dyeing, or finishing. Levi's did everything in-house. Ground floor, receiving and raw materials storage. Bolts of denim arrived by railcar from Cone Mills in North Carolina. The company had switched from Amiskeg to Cone in 1915 for their proprietary XX denim, dyed with synthetic indigo and woven on specialized looms. The fabric arrived in 100-yard rolls, each weighing 47 pounds. Storage capacity, 2 million yards. Second floor, cutting rooms. This was where scale became visible. 40 industrial cutting tables, each 30 feet long, arranged in parallel rows. Cutters, mostly men, unionized through the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, despite the industry name, would stack 50 layers of denim on each table, trace patterns with chalk, then cut through all 50 layers simultaneously using electric rotary saws. A single cutter could produce 400 individual pieces per hour. Waste rate, less than 4%. The scraps went to a basement workshop where they were repurposed into pot holders, rags, and sample materials. Third through sixth floors, sewing operations. This was the heart of the factory. 600 industrial sewing machines arranged in assembly line formation, each operator responsible for one specific task. One woman sewed nothing but inseams, 8 hours daily, 5 seams per minute. Another attached belt loops. Another stitched pocket bags. Another performed the arcuate stitch on back pockets, the distinctive double arc pattern that Levi's would trademark in 1943, making it the first clothing design ever trademarked in the United States. The sewing floors ran on piece rate pay. If you completed your quota, typically 180 to 220 operations per day, depending on complexity, you earned your base wage. Exceed quota by 20%, earn a 20% bonus. The fastest operators could make $35 per week, nearly double the entry wage. But the work was relentless. Noise from 600 machines running simultaneously made conversation impossible. Lint filled the air, the floors vibrated. Women wore cloths over their noses. Breaks were 10 minutes at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., plus 30 minutes for lunch. Bathroom visits were monitored. More than 3 per shift triggered supervisor scrutiny. 7th floor, finishing and inspection. Every pair of jeans passed through quality control. Inspectors, always women, always senior employees with at least 5 years' experience, examined seams, checked rivet placement, tested button holes, measured inseam length. Rejection rate, roughly 8%. Rejected items went back to specific operators for repair, tracked by employee number stitched inside the waistband. 3 rejections in 1 week meant a disciplinary meeting. 5 meant termination. 8th floor, executive offices, design studios, and pattern making. This was where decisions happened. Walter Haas Sr., who married into the Stern family and became company president in 1928, maintained an office overlooking the production floor. He could see the entire operation from his desk. He insisted on walking the floors daily, talking to operators, watching for bottlenecks. Haas was 35 when he took control, a University of California, Berkeley, graduate with no fashion experience, but deep respect for manufacturing efficiency. He understood the company's advantage. They could produce higher quality at competitive prices because they controlled every step. But Valencia Street was more than a factory. It was a neighborhood anchor. By 1930, the complex employed 3,200 workers. Most lived within walking distance: Mission District, Bernal Heights, Potrero Hill. They shopped at corner stores on their way home, bought houses with factory wages, sent their children to local schools. The factory whistle at 7 a.m., noon, and 5 p.m. regulated the rhythm of entire blocks. Lunch trucks parked on Valencia and 16th Street daily, serving tamales, sandwiches, and coffee to workers who had 30 minutes to eat. The union played a critical role. ILGWU. Local 112 negotiated the first formal contract with Levi Strauss and Company in 1935, establishing minimum wages, $22 per week, and overtime pay, time and a half after 44 hours, and grievance procedures. The company resisted initially. Haas believed direct relationships with workers were better than union intermediaries. But after a brief strike in June 1935, he relented. The contract signing happened in the 8th floor conference room. Haas shook hands with Union President Rose Pessotta. "We both want the same thing," he said, "fair pay for good work." That compact held for 67 years. By 1940, Valencia Street produced 18 million pairs of jeans annually. Revenue exceeded $20 million. Employment peaked at 3,500. Levi's controlled approximately 25% of the U.S. workwear market. The factory ran 3 shifts during World War II, supplying military contracts. Women who'd never worked outside their homes operated sewing machines to replace men deployed overseas. Production hit 22 million pairs in 1944. After the war, demand didn't decline, it exploded. Returning veterans wanted durable clothing. Teenagers adopted jeans as rebellion against their parents' dress codes. Levi's became the default American pant. The Valencia Street factory couldn't keep pace. The company added facilities in San Jose, El Paso, and Blackstone, Virginia. But Valencia remained the flagship, the place where quality standards were set, where new designs were tested, where the company's identity lived. The workers knew it. When you told someone in San Francisco you worked at Levi's, you meant Valencia Street. It wasn't just a job. It was membership in something that built the city. The factory had survived the 1906 earthquake, the Depression, 2 world wars. It felt permanent. In the executive suite, Haas believed the company's advantage was simple: make quality products, treat workers fairly, stay private to avoid Wall Street pressure. That philosophy would guide the company through explosive growth. It would make Levi's the most recognized brand in American fashion, until the philosophy became a liability, until treating workers fairly looked like a competitive disadvantage, until staying private meant fighting activist investors who saw the factory not as an asset, but as a cost to be eliminated. But in 1950, that reckoning was decades away. And at Valencia Street, third shift was just starting. Machines hummed, denim moved through stations. Women stitched identical seams 8 hours straight, building the jeans that would clothe America, and never imagining the day the machines would go silent, when everyone wore the same jeans. By 1971, Levi's controlled over 50% of the U.S. men's denim market. That number, 50%, doesn't capture the reality. In practical terms, Levi's wasn't competing in the denim market. They were the denim market. If you wanted jeans in 1971, you bought 501s unless you had a specific reason not to. They were sold in every department store, every Army surplus shop, every rural general store from Maine to California. Price, $6 to $8 depending on region. The same jeans worn by construction workers in Detroit were worn by college students at Berkeley, by farmers in Iowa, by factory workers in North Carolina, by hippies in Haight-Ashbury. This wasn't market dominance through aggressive expansion. This was cultural saturation. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1970, Levi Strauss and Company and sold approximately 250 million pairs of jeans globally, generating $450 million in revenue. The Valencia Street factory alone produced 35 million pairs annually, roughly 135,000 pairs daily across 3 shifts. U.S. facilities in El Paso, Blackstone, San Antonio, and 8 other cities produced another 180 million pairs. International factories in Belgium, France, and the Philippines added 35 million more. But scale doesn't explain ubiquity. Plenty of companies produce volume. What made Levi's different in 1971 was that 3 generations had grown up believing 501s were simply what jeans were supposed to be. The design hadn't fundamentally changed since 1890. Button fly, 5 pockets, copper rivets, selvage denim, arcuate stitching. That consistency, wearing essentially the same garment your grandfather wore, created trust that transcended fashion. The jeans lasted. That mattered. A pair of 501s purchased in 1971 would survive 5 years of regular wear, maybe 10 years if you weren't doing heavy labor. The denim was 13-ounce weight, thick enough to resist tearing, heavy enough to break in slowly. The indigo dye faded with washing, creating unique wear patterns. No 2 pairs aged identically. That personalization, earned through use rather than purchased through design variation, made them feel like your jeans, not just a pair of jeans. The pricing reinforced accessibility. At $6.50 retail, 501s cost roughly 4 hours of median wage labor in 1971. Affordable, but not cheap. You saved for them if you were a teenager, and you bought 2 pairs annually if you were a working adult. They occupied a strange economic space. Premium quality at democratic prices. Levi's could maintain that balance because their manufacturing efficiency, honed over 80 years, gave them margins competitors couldn't match while keeping retail prices accessible. Walter Haas Jr., who became CEO in 1958 after his father's death, understood the brand's position instinctively. He was 43 when he took control, Stanford educated, served in World War II, worked every division of the company before ascending. Haas believed Levi's succeeded because they never chased fashion. They provided reliability. In a 1967 interview with Fortune, he said, "We make pants people can trust. That's the entire strategy." But the culture was shifting in ways Haas didn't fully anticipate. Jeans were no longer just worker clothing. They'd become a political statement. In the 1960s, wearing Levi's signaled rejection of corporate conformity. College students wore them to protest. Civil rights marchers wore them in Selma. Anti-war demonstrators wore them in Washington. The jeans represented authenticity, labor, American egalitarianism, all the things countercultural movements claimed to defend. Levi's didn't encourage this association. They barely acknowledged it, but they didn't fight it either. Sales to the 18 to 25 demographic exploded from roughly 15% of total volume in 1960 to over 40% by 1970. Here's the paradox. Levi's became a symbol of anti-establishment rebellion while being manufactured by one of the most paternalistic establishment companies in American industry. Valencia Street still ran on union contracts negotiated through formal channels. Workers still received health benefits, pension contributions, and profit-sharing bonuses. The Haas family still made decisions privately, resisting outside investors, maintaining long-term relationships with suppliers. This wasn't ruthless capitalism. It was industrial-era partnership between ownership and labor, and it was phenomenally profitable. Net margins in 1970 hovered around 11%, extraordinary for apparel manufacturing, where 5 to 7% was typical. Return on assets exceeded 18%. The company carried virtually no debt. Cash reserves topped $180 million. By every financial metric, Levi Strauss and Company was a model of sustainable growth. But Haas saw problems others missed. In 1968, he commissioned an internal study. What happens when fashion changes? The study, conducted by McKinsey & Company, concluded that Levi's faced minimal risk because workwear transcends fashion cycles. Jeans weren't subject to hemline fluctuations or color trends. They were functional items with multi-year replacement cycles. The report recommended continued investment in manufacturing capacity and vertical integration. Haas wasn't convinced. He saw European designers beginning to experiment with denim. He saw competitors like Lee and Wrangler introducing fit variations. He saw department stores requesting different washes, different colors, different cuts. The market was fragmenting from universal workwear toward fashion segmentation. In 1971, at age 56, Haas made a decision that would define the company's next decade. He took Levi's public. The IPO launched in March 1971. I'm pricing at $28 per share and raising $127 million. The Haas family retained 85% ownership through a dual-class share structure, maintaining control while accessing public capital. Wall Street analysts called it a blue-chip consumer brand with exceptional stability. First-day trading pushed the stock to $34. By year-end, it hit $42. Haas used the capital to expand production capacity. New factories in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Missouri. Total U.S. manufacturing employment grew from 22,000 in 1970 to over 28,000 by 1975. He invested in international distribution, opening retail operations in Japan, Australia, and Germany. He launched new product lines, Levi's for women, corduroys, casual shirts. Revenue climbed from $450 million in 1970 to $1.2 billion by 1975. On paper, everything was working. The company was growing. Employment was rising. Profits were strong. The stock price tripled in 4 years. But going public changed the conversation inside the company. Suddenly, every quarterly earnings call included questions about margin compression, labor costs, and manufacturing efficiency. Analysts asked why Levi's operated 30 U.S. factories when competitors were shifting production to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, where wages averaged $1.20 per hour versus $8.50 in the United States. Haas would respond patiently. Our advantage is quality control and speed to market. We can't achieve that with contract manufacturing 8,000 miles away. He'd point to customer satisfaction ratings, brand loyalty metrics, premium pricing power. The analysts would nod and ask the same questions next quarter. In 1979, Haas retired. He'd led the company for 21 years, grown revenue 20-fold, maintained labor peace, kept manufacturing domestic. He believed he'd positioned Levi's to weather anything. His successor, Robert Groman, lasted 3 years before resigning under board pressure. The issue wasn't performance. Revenue continued growing. The issue was that Groman couldn't articulate a strategy to defend 18% labor cost margins when the industry average was dropping to 8%. He was replaced in 1984 by Robert Haas, Walter Jr.'s son, who immediately faced the question his grandfather and father had avoided. Does manufacturing location matter if the product looks identical? Robert Haas believed it did matter. For 8 years, he fought to preserve domestic production. He modernized factories, invested in automation, negotiated wage freezes with unions. Employment at Valencia Street stabilized around 2,800. The factory remained profitable on a direct cost basis. Revenue exceeded operating expenses. But opportunity cost haunted every board meeting. How much more profitable could Levi's be if they manufactured offshore? By 1990, the company was still dominant, but the ground was shifting. Fashion denim brands like Calvin Klein, Guess, and Diesel were selling jeans for $60 to $100, positioning Levi's as commodity workwear. Discount retailers were pressuring Levi's to lower wholesale prices. The 501s that had clothed 3 generations suddenly looked generic. And in the executive suite, a new generation of leaders was asking a dangerous question. What if the factory isn't an asset? What if it's a liability we've been too sentimental to acknowledge? The workers at Valencia Street didn't hear those conversations. They showed up at 7 a.m., ran their machines, met their quotas, collected their paychecks. They assumed the factory that survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars would survive whatever came next. They had 12 years left. The world changes, quietly. In the 1980s, Levi's was still winning, while the ground underneath it began to shift. The numbers looked good. Revenue climbed from $2.1 billion in 1980 to $4.2 billion by 1990. Market share in U.S. jeans held steady around 48%. The Valencia Street factory ran at 92% capacity. Union contracts were renewed without strikes. Wall Street analysts maintained buy ratings. From the outside, Levi's appeared invincible. But inside the industry, a transformation was accelerating that would make domestic manufacturing economically indefensible, and Levi's leadership couldn't decide whether to resist it or join it. The shift started in Asia. In 1980, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong collectively produced roughly 180 million pairs of jeans annually, mostly for export to the United States and Europe. By 1990, that number exceeded 1.1 billion pairs. China, barely registering in 1980, was producing 400 million pairs by 1990. The math was brutal. A seamstress in Guangdong province earned 35 cents per hour in 1990. A seamstress at Valencia Street earned $14.50 per hour, 41 times more. But the wage gap was only part of the equation. Asian manufacturers had cracked the code on quality consistency. In 1980, American retailers complained that imported jeans had irregular stitching, inconsistent sizing, and unreliable dye lots. By 1985, those complaints had evaporated. Factories in Seoul and Taipei were producing jeans that met or exceeded U.S. quality standards, using the same industrial sewing machines, the same denim suppliers, and increasingly the same technical supervisors, many of them trained in American factories before accepting buyout packages to transfer their knowledge overseas. Gordon Shank was one of them. He'd worked at Levi's El Paso facility for 18 years, rising from floor supervisor to production manager. In 1987, he accepted a consulting contract with a South Korean manufacturer, Golden Phoenix Textiles, for $85,000 annually, double his Levi's salary. His job: replicate Levi's production systems in Incheon. He trained cutting room staff on pattern efficiency, taught quality inspectors Levi's defect standards, and set up piece rate systems identical to Valencia Street's. Within 14 months, Golden Phoenix was producing jeans that Shank admitted in a 1989 interview with Apparel Industry magazine. "I couldn't distinguish from our domestic product in a blind test." Levi's leadership watched this happen with a mixture of denial and paralysis. Robert Haas, who became CEO in 1984 at age 47, genuinely believed that domestic manufacturing provided intangible value that financial models couldn't capture. He talked about it constantly, in investor calls, in employee meetings, in interviews. "Our workers have institutional knowledge," he'd say. "They understand denim in ways you can't teach in 3 months. That's worth protecting." But the board was skeptical. By 1987, Levi's operated 63 manufacturing facilities worldwide, 43 in the United States, 20 internationally. The U.S. facilities employed 22,000 workers with an average fully loaded labor cost of $18.75 per hour, including benefits. The international facilities employed 8,200 workers, averaging $2.10 per hour. A pair of 501s cost $4.23 to manufacture in San Antonio. The same jeans cost $1.85 to manufacture in the Philippines. Yet Levi's kept retail prices stable, $22 to $28 for 501s throughout the 1980s. They absorbed the cost differential through margin compression. Operating margins dropped from 14.2% in 1980 to 9.8% by 1988. Wall Street noticed. The stock, which had traded at $48 in 1981, languished at $31 in 1988, despite revenue doubling. Activist investors began circling. In 1987, a group led by the Bass brothers proposed a leveraged buyout at $48 per share, valuing the company at $3.6 billion. The Haas family, which still controlled 85% of voting shares, rejected it. But the proposal exposed a harsh truth. Public markets valued Levi's manufacturing infrastructure as a liability worth eliminating, not an asset worth maintaining. So, in 1996, Robert Haas orchestrated a management buyout, taking the company private again for $4.4 billion, financed largely through debt. The move was supposed to free Levi's from quarterly earnings pressure, allowing them to make long-term decisions about manufacturing strategy. Instead, it created financial pressure that made factory closures inevitable. The debt service was crushing, $280 million annually, in cash flow that had previously funded capital improvements and worker bonuses now serviced leveraged buyout loans. By 1997, the company needed to cut costs immediately and dramatically. Consultants from Bain & Company were brought in to identify savings opportunities. Their report, delivered in August 1997, was blunt. Domestic manufacturing represents 31% of COGS while producing 38% of volume. Eliminating U.S. production would improve EBITDA margins by 4 to 6 percentage points within 18 months. Haas resisted. He commissioned counter-studies showing that closing domestic factories would damage brand perception, alienate core customers, and sacrifice quality control. But the numbers were hard to argue with. In 1997, Levi's global sales were declining for the first time in 20 years, down 4% to $6.8 billion. Market share was eroding as fashion brands like Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein dominated premium segments, while discount brands like Old Navy captured value shoppers. Levi's was stuck in the middle, neither premium nor budget, bleeding customers in both directions. Then came the competitors who weren't competing on brand at all. They were competing on speed. Zara, H&M, and other fast fashion retailers were using global supply chains to move from design to retail floor in 30 days. Levi's took 9 to 12 months from concept to store delivery because they designed in San Francisco, manufactured domestically, and moved product through traditional wholesale distribution. By the time Levi's responded to a trend, the trend was over. The workers saw hints of trouble. In 1998, Levi's announced the closure of 11 U.S. plants, including facilities in El Paso, San Antonio, and Powell, Tennessee. 6,400 jobs eliminated. The company offered severance packages, 2 weeks' pay per year of service, plus job retraining vouchers worth up to $3,000. The average displaced worker was 46 years old with 14 years at Levi's, meaning they received roughly $11,000 in severance. Not enough to retire, not enough to relocate, just enough to survive while searching for work that didn't exist. Valencia Street survived the 1998 cuts. The factory was profitable, producing 28 million pairs annually with 2,600 employees. Local politicians lobbied to protect it. San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown met with Robert Haas personally, arguing that closing Valencia would devastate the Mission District. Haas agreed. Valencia would remain open, but the pressure kept building. In 1999, Levi's revenues dropped another 7% to $5.1 billion. In 2000, they dropped 13% to $4.4 billion. The company was shrinking. Competitors weren't just taking market share, they were redefining what jeans meant to consumers. Levi's 501s represented authenticity and durability. But in 2000, consumers, especially the crucial 18 to 25 demographic, wanted style and variety. They wanted low-rise, bootcut, distressed, embellished. They wanted new designs every season. Levi's couldn't deliver that while maintaining domestic production. The capital investment required to retool U.S. factories for rapid style variation was prohibitive. Offshore contract manufacturers could switch designs in weeks because they weren't burdened by fixed factory costs. They operated on flexible contracts, scaling up or down based on orders. In 2001, after 3 straight years of declining revenue, Robert Haas stepped down as CEO. He remained chairman but handed operational control to Philip Marineau, a 54-year-old executive recruited from PepsiCo, where he'd run the Frito-Lay division. Marineau had never worked in apparel. He'd built his reputation on supply chain efficiency and aggressive cost management. His hiring signaled a strategic shift the board wouldn't say explicitly. Manufacturing location was about to become negotiable. Marineau spent his first 6 months touring Levi's global operations. He visited Valencia Street in October 2001, walking the sewing floors, meeting shift supervisors, talking to workers who'd been there 30 years. He was polite, asked good questions, thanked everyone for their dedication. He didn't promise anything. 3 weeks later, he presented a restructuring plan to the board. The recommendation was unambiguous: close all remaining U.S. manufacturing within 18 months. Move production entirely to contract manufacturers in China, Mexico, and Central America. Expected annual savings: $250 to $300 million. Expected job losses: 8,000, including every worker at Valencia Street. The board met for 7 hours. Robert Haas argued against it. He said the brand was built on American manufacturing, that closing domestic factories would alienate loyal customers, that the savings were short-term but the damage would be permanent. The board voted 9-2 to approve Marineau's plan. On September 25, 2002, Levi Strauss and Company announced the closure of its remaining 6 U.S. factories, including Valencia Street. Production would shift to over 50 contract manufacturing facilities in 30 countries. The company would retain design, marketing, and distribution in the United States. But the jeans themselves, the physical products that built the brand, would no longer be made by Levi's employees anywhere. In San Francisco, workers arriving for second shift at Valencia Street saw the news on television before management made the formal announcement. There was no warning, no consultation, just a press release explaining that their jobs would end within 8 months. One woman, Maria Gonzalez, had worked the same sewing station for 23 years. She made $16.80 per hour. She was 49 years old. She spoke limited English. She'd raised 3 children on Levi's wages, bought a small house in Daly City, sent her oldest daughter to San Francisco State. When reporters asked what she'd do next, she said, "I don't know. This is all I know." That sentence, "This is all I know," could have been spoken by thousands. Because Levi's hadn't just employed workers, they'd created a manufacturing ecosystem where skills, identity, and economic security were inseparable from the factory itself. Now the factory was closing, and what followed would prove that efficiency isn't the same as wisdom, and that some costs don't appear on spreadsheets until it's too late to reverse them. The decision that ended American denim. In 2002, Philip Marineau announced the closure of Levi's last U.S. factories. The press conference happened on September 25th at company headquarters, 1155 Battery Street in San Francisco. Marineau stood before 24 reporters and read from a prepared statement. His voice was steady, his demeanor professional. "Today we are announcing a difficult but necessary restructuring of our global production network," he said. "This decision will allow Levi Strauss and Company to remain competitive in a rapidly changing marketplace while preserving our brand's legacy for future generations." The word legacy hung in the air, because what Marineau was actually announcing was the complete severance of product from place. The final abandonment of the belief that where jeans were made mattered to what they meant. The business logic was straightforward. Levi's 6 remaining U.S. plants, San Antonio, Texas, Knoxville, Tennessee, Valdosta, Georgia, San Francisco, California, and 2 facilities in El Paso, Texas, employed 8,150 workers, producing approximately 185 million units annually. Total annual labor cost, roughly $340 million. Moving that same production to contract manufacturers in China, Mexico, Honduras, and Bangladesh would cost an estimated $95 million annually. Net savings, $245 million. For a company carrying $1.7 billion in debt from the 1996 leveraged buyout, $245 million in annual savings wasn't marginal. It was existential. Debt service alone consumed $290 million yearly. Operating margins had compressed to 4.2% by 2002, down from 9.8% in 1998. Revenue continued declining. $4.1 billion in 2001, projected to drop below $4 billion in 2002. The company was shrinking while servicing debt structured for growth. Wall Street analysts called the closure announcement overdue. Morgan Stanley issued a research note the next day. Management is finally addressing structural cost disadvantages that have plagued Levi for over a decade. We view this as necessary but insufficient. The note went on to recommend further cuts to corporate overhead, suggesting the company could eliminate an additional 1,200 non-manufacturing jobs. Marineau's internal pitch to the board had been more explicit than his public comments. In an August 2002 presentation, later leaked to the San Francisco Chronicle, he outlined what he called terminal decline scenarios. If Levi's maintained U.S. manufacturing, revenue would continue dropping 8 to 10% annually, reaching $2.8 billion by 2006. At that trajectory, the company would breach debt covenants by 2005, triggering default provisions that could force bankruptcy. But here's what the spreadsheets didn't capture. Marineau was solving a financial problem by destroying a strategic asset he didn't understand existed. Levi's advantage had never been manufacturing efficiency. Asian contractors could always sew cheaper. The advantage was control. When Levi's owned the factories, they controlled quality, timing, capacity, and institutional knowledge. That control allowed them to maintain consistent standards across millions of units, respond to demand fluctuations within weeks, and build products that reliably met customer expectations. Once production moved to independent contractors operating on thin margins across 30 countries, that control evaporated. Levi's would become a brand company, designing products and marketing them, while outsourcing the actual creation of those products to the lowest bidder. And the lowest bidder's incentive structure was fundamentally misaligned with brand protection. But in September 2002, those consequences were theoretical. The financial crisis was immediate. The closure timeline gave workers 8 months' notice. Valencia Street would cease operations on April 15, 2003. San Antonio would close March 31st. Knoxville by May 15th. Workers received severance packages calculated at 3 weeks' pay per year of service, plus health insurance continuation for 6 months, plus retraining vouchers worth $4,000. For someone like Rosa Martinez, who'd worked at Valencia Street for 28 years, that meant approximately $15,400 in severance. She was 54 years old, earned $17.20 per hour as a senior quality inspector, had no college degree, and spoke English as a second language. The $4,000 retraining voucher qualified her for a 6-month certificate program at City College of San Francisco, medical billing, computer networking, or administrative assistance. Rosa chose medical billing. She attended classes 3 days per week while searching for work. The program taught her to navigate insurance codes, process claims, and use billing software. After completing the certificate in February 2004, she applied for 37 positions. She received 2 interviews, no offers. The problem wasn't credentials, it was age. Employers hiring for $12 per hour medical billing positions wanted recent college graduates they could train for advancement. A 55-year-old with manufacturing experience and a certificate didn't fit the profile. By August 2004, Rosa was working part-time at Target for $9.25 per hour, stocking shelves and operating the cash register. Her annual income dropped from $35,800 at Levi's to roughly $15,000. She lost her house in Daly City, couldn't make mortgage payments on retail wages. She moved in with her daughter's family in Hayward. Rosa's story wasn't unique. A study commissioned by the California Department of Labor tracked 2,200 displaced Valencia Street workers through 2006. The findings were devastating. 68% were still unemployed or underemployed, earning less than 75% of their Levi's wages, 3 years after closure. Median wage drop for those who found work: 42%, 34% lost their homes to foreclosure or short sale. 12% had relocated out of state, searching for manufacturing work that no longer existed. These weren't abstract statistics. These were people who'd built lives around the belief that competence and loyalty created security. They'd shown up on time, met quotas, trained new workers, voted on union contracts that sometimes meant accepting wage freezes to keep the factory competitive. They'd done everything right according to the social contract that governed American manufacturing for a century. Work hard, produce quality, and your employer will maintain your livelihood. That contract was voided by PowerPoint presentation. But the human cost, however real, didn't change the business calculation. Marineau wasn't being cruel. He was being rational within the framework he'd been hired to operate. Maximize shareholder value by reducing costs. The workers were costs. Removing them improved the equation. And initially, it worked. Levi's first full year without U.S. manufacturing, 2004, saw gross margins improve from 34.1% to 37.8%. Operating income jumped $180 million. The company accelerated debt repayment. Stock analysts praised management's disciplined execution. Marineau received a $2.4 million performance bonus on top of his $1.1 million base salary. But something else was happening that wouldn't appear in financial statements for another 3 years. Something that would prove that place and product weren't as separable as the spreadsheets assumed. Within 6 months of closing Valencia Street, quality complaints started rising. Not dramatically, customer service reports showed defect rates increasing from 2.3% to 3.8% in 2003. Explainable as temporary disruption during the manufacturing transition. But by 2005, defect rates hit 6.2%. By 2007, they exceeded 9%. The problems were inconsistent stitching, irregular sizing, die lot variations, and premature rivet failure. Individual issues were minor, but collectively, they eroded the fundamental promise Levi's had maintained for 130 years. These jeans work, and they last. More damaging was what happened with counterfeits. When Levi's controlled manufacturing, they controlled fabric sourcing, pattern cutting, and finishing techniques. Replicating authentic Levi's required access to proprietary processes that competitors couldn't easily copy. But once production moved to contract factories in China serving multiple brands, those processes became widely accessible. The same factory producing genuine Levi's on Monday could produce near-identical counterfeits on Saturday, using the same equipment, same denim suppliers, same trained workers. By 2006, the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition estimated that counterfeit Levi's represented 35% of all fake apparel seized at U.S. Customs, up from 12% in 2001. The fakes were so convincing that even retail employees couldn't reliably distinguish them without checking serial numbers. Levi's spent $18 million annually on anti-counterfeiting enforcement, inspecting warehouses, suing distributors, training customs officials. That $18 million was roughly equal to the annual operating profit from the closed Valencia Street facility. But the deepest damage was narrative. For 130 years, Levi's story was inseparable from American manufacturing. The jeans weren't just products, they were artifacts of a place, made by identifiable people connected to a specific industrial tradition. That story justified premium pricing. It created emotional loyalty that transcended rational brand preference. Once the factories closed, that story collapsed. The jeans were still called Levi's, and they still had rivets and arcuate stitching. But they were made by anonymous workers in factories Levi's didn't own, in countries most American customers couldn't locate on a map. The brand became a logo, not a legacy, and consumers noticed. Market research conducted by Levi's in 2007 found that 62% of customers believed the brand had lost authenticity compared to 5 years earlier. When asked why, the most common responses were, "Not made in America anymore," and "Quality isn't what it used to be." Sales continued declining. Revenue dropped from $4.1 billion in 2003 to $4.0 billion in 2007, despite eliminating $245 million in annual labor costs. The savings had been consumed by increased marketing spend, trying to rebuild brand perception, higher quality control costs managing overseas contractors, and legal fees fighting counterfeiters. But Philip Marineau left the company in 2006, recruited to become CEO of Alberto Culver. His tenure at Levi's was considered successful by the standards that mattered to boards. He'd stabilized finances, reduced structural costs, and positioned the company for potential sale. That the brand was weaker, the product less distinctive, and 8,000 workers displaced was outside the scorecard. His replacement, John Anderson, inherited a brand that had saved hundreds of millions in labor costs, but lost what made those costs worth bearing. The factories were gone. The workers were scattered. The competitive advantage built over 130 years, the ability to tell a true story about craft, place, and people, had been sacrificed for margin improvement that evaporated within 4 years. On April 15, 2003, the last shift at Valencia Street ended at 5 p.m. While the machines were powered down, workers collected their tools, scissors, seam rippers, measuring tapes they'd purchased themselves. Some had worked there 35 years. They hugged each other. Some cried. Many were too angry for tears. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle asked the plant manager, Dennis Wu, what would happen to the building. Wu said the company hadn't decided yet. It would either be sold to developers or repurposed for corporate offices. But not for making jeans, the reporter said. No, Wu said, not for making jeans. The building sat empty for 18 months. Then it was sold to a developer for $34 million. Within 3 years, it would become luxury condos. And the jeans that once carried the label "Made in San Francisco, USA" would carry labels from Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam, countries where workers earned in a day what Valencia Street workers earned in an hour. The decision was final. The consequences were just beginning. What happens when place is removed? Within 3 years, Levi's jeans were cheaper to make and easier to copy. The problems started small. In January 2004, customer service representatives at Levi's headquarters began logging complaints that seemed minor individually, but formed a pattern collectively. Jeans with asymmetric inseams, one leg measuring 31.5 inches, the other 32 inches, button-fly closures with misaligned holes, back pocket arcuate stitching that wavered off the template pattern, belt loops attached at inconsistent intervals. None of these were catastrophic defects. The jeans were wearable, but they violated the precision that customers had unconsciously relied on for decades. When you bought 501s, you expected them to be identical to every other pair you'd owned. That consistency was the product, not just the denim, but the predictability. By mid-2004, customer service was receiving roughly 1,800 quality-related complaints monthly, up from 650 in 2002. The defect rate, measured as percentage of units returned or flagged during retail inspection, climbed from 2.3% to 4.1%. Levi's quality control director, Margaret Chen, flagged the issue in a June 2004 memo to operations leadership. We are experiencing systemic consistency problems across multiple contract manufacturers. Root cause appears to be inadequate training and supervision at factory level. The memo triggered an audit of contract manufacturing facilities, and inspectors from Levi's visited 23 factories across China, Bangladesh, Mexico, and Honduras between July and September 2004. What they found was exactly what should have been predictable: factories optimized for speed and cost, not precision. At a facility in Dongguan, China, producing 180,000 pairs of Levi's jeans weekly, inspectors observed workers stitching inseams at a rate of 8 pairs per hour, 40% faster than the Valencia Street standard of 5.7 pairs per hour. The speed came from eliminating quality checkpoints. At Valencia Street, every operator had been responsible for inspecting their own work before passing it to the next station. Defective pieces were corrected immediately. At Dongguan, operators were paid purely on throughput. Inspection happened only at final quality control, after all operations were complete. Now, fixing defects at that stage meant reworking entire garments, which slowed production. So inspectors were pressured to pass marginal items rather than miss daily quotas. The factory manager at Dongguan, when asked about the inconsistencies, told inspectors, "You want quality, speed, or price? Pick two. We deliver speed and price." That wasn't incompetence. That was rational business behavior. The contract manufacturer earned $1.85 per finished unit. Levi's had negotiated that price down from $2.10 in 2003, squeezing margins to meet their own cost targets. At $1.85 per unit, the factory made money only through volume. Every minute spent on rework reduced daily output, cutting into already thin margins. The incentive structure guaranteed quality would be sacrificed whenever it conflicted with speed. Levi's tried to fix this through tighter contracts. In 2005, they rewrote supplier agreements to include penalty clauses for excessive defect rates. $0.15 per unit for batches exceeding 5% defects, escalating to $0.30 for batches over 8%. The penalties had minimal impact. Factories simply became better at concealing defects during Levi's inspections, while shipping problematic units to retailers who lacked resources to inspect every item. But quality inconsistency was the smaller problem. The catastrophic issue was counterfeits. When Levi's owned their factories, they controlled every input. Denim came from approved mills: Cone Denim in North Carolina, Kaihara in Japan, with proprietary weave patterns and dye formulations. Rivets and buttons were manufactured by suppliers under exclusive contracts, with serial numbers tracked from production through installation. Thread, zippers, leather patches, all came from verified sources. That supply chain control made authentic replication nearly impossible. A counterfeit operation would need access to identical materials from the same suppliers, processed through the same machinery. Once production moved to contract manufacturers, that control vanished. The same factories producing genuine Levi's sourced materials from the same regional suppliers used by dozens of other brands. Denim mills in China sold to whoever paid. Rivet manufacturers filled orders without exclusivity. A contract factory making Levi's on Tuesday could use identical materials to make unbranded jeans on Wednesday, or to make fake Levi's on Saturday night, off the books. And they did, extensively. In 2006, U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized 1.4 million counterfeit Levi's garments at ports of entry, triple the 2003 number. But seizures represented only a fraction of total counterfeits. Industry analysts estimated that for every fake seized, 10 reached consumers. That suggested roughly 14 million counterfeit Levi's items entered the U.S. market in 2006 alone. The fakes were sophisticated, high-quality counterfeits, produced in the same factories using the same equipment as genuine products, were virtually indistinguishable. They had correct arcuate stitching, accurate rivets, proper labels. The only difference was that Levi's hadn't authorized them and received no revenue. These weren't cheap knockoffs sold on street corners. They were near-perfect replicas sold through discount retailers, online marketplaces, and even some authorized distributors who knowingly mixed authentic and counterfeit inventory. James Crawford, Levi's director of brand protection, testified before a congressional subcommittee in March 2007 about the scope of the problem. We estimate that counterfeit Levi's products now represent between 20 and 30% of total Levi's denim sold globally, he said. This represents approximately $600 million in annual revenue loss, undermines our brand integrity, and creates quality perception issues when consumers unknowingly purchase inferior counterfeits, believing them to be genuine. What Crawford didn't say publicly, but acknowledged in internal documents, was that Levi's manufacturing strategy had made counterfeiting structurally inevitable. By outsourcing production to lowest-cost contractors, they'd created an ecosystem where factories had the expertise, equipment, and materials to produce perfect replicas, combined with the economic incentive to do so. A factory earning $1.85 per unit from Levi's could earn $8 to $12 per unit, selling the same jeans as counterfeits to distributors who didn't care about authenticity. Levi's spent $22 million on anti-counterfeiting efforts in 2006, hiring investigators, conducting factory raids, suing distributors, training law enforcement. They shut down 47 counterfeit operations that year, but new ones appeared faster than old ones closed. The problem was Hydra-headed. Solving it would have required either rebuilding proprietary manufacturing control, impossible after closing all owned facilities, or accepting that brand dilution was the permanent price of offshore production. They chose acceptance. By 2007, internal strategy documents stopped treating counterfeits as a problem to solve and started treating them as a market condition to manage. But the damage compounded. Consumers who unknowingly bought counterfeit Levi's experienced the quality problems genuine Levi's had mostly avoided: premature rivet failure, irregular fading, stitching that separated after a few washes. Those consumers blamed Levi's, not counterfeiters. The brand's reputation for durability, built over 130 years, eroded with each disappointing purchase, regardless of whether the product was genuine. Market research in 2007 showed brand perception metrics in freefall. When asked, "Do Levi's jeans represent good quality?" 71% of respondents answered yes in 2002. By 2007, that number had dropped to 52%. When asked, Are Levi's worth the price premium over cheaper alternatives? Affirmative responses dropped from 64% to 41%. The sales impact was devastating. U.S. revenue declined from $2.1 billion in 2003 to $1.6 billion in 2007, a 24% drop in 4 years. Global revenue fell from $4.1 billion to $4.0 billion, despite expanding into new markets. The company was shrinking in its core market while barely holding steady overall. Wall Street analysts who had praised the factory closures in 2002 now questioned whether management had overcorrected. A Goldman Sachs research note from August 2007 concluded, Levi's cost reduction strategy successfully improved gross margins, but failed to account for brand erosion. The company is now cheaper to operate, but less valuable as a business. Current valuation reflects a commodity apparel brand, not a premium heritage label. Inside Levi's, executives debated how to respond. Some argued for massive marketing investment to rebuild brand perception, celebrity endorsements, Super Bowl ads, flagship retail stores. Others pushed for product innovation, new fits, premium lines, technical fabrics. A minority argued for something more fundamental. Bring some manufacturing back to the U.S., even at higher cost, to reclaim the authenticity narrative. That minority was ignored. Bringing manufacturing back was economically impossible. The debt from the 1996 leveraged buyout remained, $1.3 billion in 2007, requiring $220 million annually in debt service. Labor costs had risen since 2002. Union workers at Valencia Street had earned $17.20 per hour in 2003. Comparable workers now commanded $22 per hour. Rebuilding even one domestic factory would require $40 to $60 million in capital investment, plus $25 to $30 million annually in operating costs. The financial returns didn't justify it, so Levi's doubled down on the offshore model. They consolidated contractors, reducing from 67 facilities in 2004 to 43 in 2008, concentrating volume with larger, theoretically more reliable partners. They invested in quality management systems, digital tracking, automated inspections, supplier scorecards. They hired more compliance officers to audit working conditions and production standards. None of it addressed the core problem. They no longer controlled what defined their brand. They'd become a marketing organization that bought products from vendors and stamped them with a logo. The institutional knowledge, how denim should feel, how seams should align, how rivets should be set, had retired with the workers who'd spent 30 years perfecting those details. Back in San Francisco, the Mission District was changing too. The Valencia Street factory had been demolished in 2006. Construction on luxury condos began in 2007. The development, called Valencia Commons, would offer 312 units ranging from studios at $380,000 to three-bedroom penthouses at $1.2 million. Projected rents for non-ownership units: $2,800 to $4,500 monthly. The workers who'd earned $35,000 annually stitching jeans couldn't afford to live in the building where they'd once worked. Most had left the neighborhood entirely, priced out by the same gentrification wave that made the factory site valuable to developers. A reporter from San Francisco Magazine interviewed Maria Herrera, who'd worked at Valencia Street for 31 years before the closure. In 2003, she'd earned $17.80 per hour. By 2007, she was working part-time at a dry cleaner in Oakland for $11 per hour. The reporter asked if she ever walked by the old factory site. "No," Maria said. "It would hurt too much. That building was my life. Now it's going to be apartments for people who make in a month what I made in a year. What's the point of looking?" What's the point of looking? That question applied to more than a demolished factory. It applied to an entire economic model, one that assumed you could separate craft from place, quality from people, brand from the workers who built it. Levi's had made that separation. They'd saved the money they said they needed to save. And they'd lost something that financial models couldn't quantify until it was already gone. The ability to make jeans that meant something beyond the thread they were stitched from. The hollow victory. By 2007, Levi's had saved on labor, but lost what made the brand defensible. The financial metrics told one story: gross margin improvement, 3.7 percentage points between 2003 and 2007. Operating costs reduced by $280 million annually. Debt principal paid down by $420 million. Cash flow positive in 4 of 5 years. By the measures that mattered to private equity and corporate boards, the restructuring had succeeded. But revenue told a different story. In 2007, Levi's global sales reached $4.1 billion, exactly where they'd been in 2003 before closing the U.S. factories. 4 years of supposed efficiency gains had produced zero growth, and worse, the revenue mix had shifted downward. Premium product lines, 501s retailing above $50, limited editions, collaborations, had shrunk from 28% of sales in 2003 to 19% in 2007. The growth came entirely from value segments. Jeans sold through discount retailers like Walmart and Target at $22 to $28, competing directly against private label brands. Levi's had become what they'd spent 130 years avoiding: a mid-tier commodity brand with no sustainable advantage. The strategic problem was simple but unsolvable within the structure they'd created. Every decision that improved short-term financials undermined long-term differentiation. They needed to cut costs, so they squeezed contractor margins, which degraded quality. They needed volume, so they sold through discount channels, which cheapened brand perception. They needed marketing impact, so they licensed the Levi's name to accessories and home goods, which diluted the core identity. John Anderson, who became CEO in 2006, understood the trap. He was 52 years old, previously ran Foot Locker, had a reputation for brand turnarounds. His first major presentation to the board in February 2007 diagnosed the problem clearly. "We've optimized for cost efficiency in a business where cost efficiency cannot be the primary competitive advantage. Our product is undifferentiated, our brand is weakening, and we have no manufacturing moat. We are vulnerable to any competitor who can tell a better story or move faster to trends." Anderson proposed a 3-part strategy: rebuild premium positioning, invest in innovation, and create brand fortresses, flagship stores in major cities that would showcase Levi's heritage and justify higher prices. The plan required $180 million in upfront investment with payback projected over 5 to 7 years. The board approved a scaled-back version, $65 million over 2 years, focused mostly on marketing. Manufacturing remained entirely offshore. Innovation would be limited to fit variations and fabric treatments that contractors could execute. No discussion of bringing production back to the U.S. That door was permanently closed. Anderson launched the initiative in fall 2007. Levi's opened flagship stores in San Francisco, New York, and Chicago with exposed brick, vintage sewing machines as decoration, and wall displays showing archival photographs of Valencia Street workers. The stores sold premium 501s for $78 to $128, marketed as authentic heritage denim. Sales associates were trained to tell customers about Levi's 150-year history, the original rivet patent, the cultural significance of the brand. What they couldn't say, what the vintage photographs obscured, was that none of the jeans in those flagship stores were made by Levi's workers anymore. The heritage being sold was historical, not current. The brand was cosplaying its own past. Customers noticed the disconnect. Online reviews of the flagship stores were consistently skeptical. A typical comment from a Yelp review of the San Francisco location in January 2008. Beautiful store, great vibe, interesting history. But $98 for jeans made in Bangladesh? I bought 3 pairs of vintage Levi's at a thrift store for $60 total, and they're better quality than anything new here. And this feels like paying extra for a story that isn't true anymore. That review captured the fundamental problem. Authenticity can't be manufactured through retail design. It requires correspondence between narrative and reality. Levi's was selling a manufacturing heritage story while manufacturing nothing. The contradiction was visible to anyone paying attention, but most customers weren't paying that much attention. They bought jeans at Macy's or online, not at flagship stores. For them, Levi's was simply one option among dozens, functionally similar to Lee, Wrangler, Gap, Old Navy, or any other denim brand. Market research in 2008 found that 63% of jeans purchasers couldn't articulate meaningful differences between brands. They chose based on price, fit, and availability. Brand loyalty, which had been Levi's greatest asset, had eroded to the point of irrelevance. Meanwhile, competitors were succeeding with strategies Levi's couldn't execute. Fast fashion brands like Zara and H&M were selling trendy denim for $29 to $49, turning over styles every 6 weeks. Premium brands like 7 for All Mankind and True Religion were selling $180 to $300 jeans, positioned as fashion items, not heritage workwear. Levi's occupied the fatal middle ground, too expensive to be value, too generic to be premium. The 2008 financial crisis accelerated Levi's decline. Consumer spending on apparel dropped 11% that year. Discretionary purchases shifted toward extreme value or justified luxury. Mid-priced brands suffered most. Levi's revenue fell from $4.1 billion in 2007 to $3.9 billion in 2008 to $3.6 billion in 2009. Operating income turned negative for the first time since 1984. Anderson announced another restructuring in March 2009. 1,800 job cuts, mostly corporate staff in San Francisco. Marketing budgets reduced 30%. The flagship store initiative was quietly abandoned. The Chicago location closed after 14 months. The company shifted focus entirely to survival, maintained cash flow, service debt, cut everything non-essential. But here's what made the crisis especially bitter. Levi's had eliminated their manufacturing base precisely to become financially flexible, to reduce fixed costs, to be able to scale up or down with market conditions. That flexibility was supposed to make them resilient. Instead, it made them hollow. When revenue dropped, they had nothing to fall back on. They didn't own factories they could retool for different products. They didn't employ workers whose skills could be redeployed. They didn't have proprietary manufacturing processes that created barriers to entry. They were a brand stamped on products made by contractors who served multiple clients and felt no loyalty to any of them. And those contractors were becoming competitors. In 2009, several Chinese manufacturers that had produced Levi's jeans for years began launching their own denim brands, using the same equipment, same materials, same workers, same expertise they developed while making Levi's. They sold directly to retailers at prices Levi's couldn't match because they eliminated the brand premium. A pair of jeans that cost retailers $18 from Levi's cost $11 from a contractor's house brand. Quality was indistinguishable. Levi's threatened legal action, claiming intellectual property violations. The contractors responded accurately. They weren't copying anything protected. The basic jean design was public domain. The manufacturing techniques were standard industry practice. They were simply offering retailers a cheaper alternative to paying for a brand name. Levi's learned the hard lesson that brands without differentiated products eventually become optional. Retailers started replacing Levi's with contractor house brands in value segments. By 2010, Walmart, Levi's second-largest retail customer, had reduced Levi's shelf space by 40%, replacing it with Faded Glory, their private label brand, produced by the same Chinese factories that made Levi's. The executives who championed the factory closures were gone by then. Philip Marineau had left in 2006 for a CEO position elsewhere. His legacy secure, he'd stabilize Levi's finances and position the company for whatever came next. What came next wasn't his problem. John Anderson resigned in 2011, replaced by Chip Bergh, another outside executive from Procter & Gamble. Bergh's mandate was narrower than Anderson's had been. Stabilize revenue, prepare for potential IPO, maintain cost discipline, not growth, not innovation, just survival. The workers who'd lost their jobs in 2002 to 2003 were scattered by 2010. Many had never recovered economically. A 2010 follow-up study by UC Berkeley's Labor Center tracked 840 former Valencia Street employees. The findings were grim. Median income in 2010, $22,400, down from $36,800 in 2002, adjusted for inflation. 52% had experienced at least one period of unemployment lasting 6+ months. Since 2003, 28% had declared bankruptcy. 41% had lost their homes. 18% had relocated out of California, mostly to lower-cost states where manufacturing wages were even worse. These weren't failures of individual initiative. These were systemic consequences of eliminating an entire employment sector without creating alternatives. The promise had been that displaced workers could retrain for new industries. Technology, healthcare, services. But a 52-year-old seamstress with 28 years at Levi's couldn't become a software engineer or a nurse. The skills weren't transferable. The age discrimination was insurmountable, so they took what they could find: retail, food service, janitorial work, home health care. Jobs that paid $9 to $13 per hour without benefits or stability. Jobs that required standing for 8 hours, but offered none of the dignity that came from crafting a product people valued. Rosa Martinez, the quality inspector who'd worked at Valencia Street for 28 years, was 62 in 2010. She'd been working at Target for 6 years, earning $10.50 per hour. She qualified for Social Security at 62, but the benefit would be permanently reduced for early claiming. $890 monthly instead of $1,340 if she waited until 66. She couldn't afford to wait. She retired in December 2010. A reporter from Mother Jones interviewed her for a 2011 article about manufacturing decline. Rosa said, "I don't blame Levi's for wanting to make more money, that's business, but I do blame them for pretending they had no choice. They had choices. They chose wrong, and we paid for it." Rosa was right. Levi's had choices. They could have maintained limited domestic production for premium lines, preserving authenticity while shifting commodity products offshore. They could have invested in automation that reduced labor costs while keeping manufacturing in-house. They could have accepted lower margins in exchange for strategic control and brand differentiation. Instead, they chose the obvious path: eliminate the most visible cost. In doing so, they eliminated their competitive advantage without recognizing it as an advantage, because it didn't appear on spreadsheets as brand authenticity asset or institutional knowledge capital. It appeared as labor cost, and labor costs should be minimized. By 2011, Levi's had succeeded at everything they'd tried to do after 2002. They'd reduced costs, they'd improved margins, they'd serviced debt, they'd survived the financial crisis, they'd stabilized as a business, but they'd failed at the only thing that mattered: remaining a brand people cared about enough to choose when alternatives existed. The jeans were still blue, they still had rivets, they still said Levi's on the leather patch, but they no longer meant what they'd meant for 130 years. They'd become industrial nostalgia, a heritage brand trading on a story it could no longer embody. And in San Francisco, where it all began, the Valencia Street factory was now luxury condos, renting for $4,200 monthly. The sewing machines were gone. The workers were scattered. The institutional knowledge, how denim should feel, how seams should align, how to build something that lasts, had retired or died or taken $10 per hour jobs at Target. What remained was a logo. And logos, as Levi's was learning, are worth exactly as much as the story behind them. When the story stops being true, the logo becomes decoration. Condos where sewing machines once roared. Today, the Valencia Street factory is luxury housing renting for over $4,000 a month. The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. In April 2003, the factory closed. By September 2005, the building was sold to Soma Development Partners for $34 million. By March 2007, demolition was complete. 8 stories of red brick reduced to rubble in 3 weeks. By November 2008, Valencia Commons opened, 312 residential units across 4 buildings, plus 18,000 square feet of ground floor retail. The architecture preserved nothing. No facade retention, no historical markers, in no acknowledgement that 3,000 people had spent decades on that site producing 35 million pairs of jeans annually. The new buildings were glass and steel, sleek and expensive, designed to attract the tech workers flooding San Francisco during the 2000s boom. 1-bedroom units started at $2,800 monthly. 2 bedrooms at $4,200. 3-bedroom penthouses at $6,500. The cheapest studio cost more per month than Rosa Martinez had earned in 6 weeks at Levi's. The development marketed itself as urban authentic living. Exposed ductwork, polished concrete floors, industrial-style lighting fixtures. The aesthetic borrowed from manufacturing without the inconvenience of actual manufacturing. Residents could enjoy the look of industrial heritage while working remote tech jobs and ordering DoorDash. The irony was perfect and invisible. Young professionals were paying premium prices to live in a building designed to evoke the industrial authenticity that had been demolished to build it. They were literally sleeping where seamstresses once stood for 8-hour shifts, occupying space that had been converted from productive labor to consumption lifestyle. Some residents didn't know the site's history. A 2014 survey by the Mission local newspaper asked 60 Valencia Commons residents what had previously occupied the site. 18 said they didn't know. 23 guessed incorrectly: warehouse, parking lot, other residential. 19 answered correctly: Levi's factory. None of the 19 who knew worked in manufacturing. Most worked in tech: engineers at Google, product managers at Uber, designers at Airbnb. One resident, Rebecca Chen, a 29-year-old software engineer earning $180,000 annually, told Mission Local, "I think it's cool that this used to be a Levi's factory. It adds character. But honestly, it's probably better use of the space now. The neighborhood needs housing more than it needs a factory that wasn't competitive anymore." That phrase, "wasn't competitive anymore," captured the entire logic. The factory employed 2,800 people, earning median wages of $35,000, injecting roughly $98 million in annual payroll into the local economy. Valencia Commons housed 312 units, generating approximately $15 million annually for one developer, creating maybe 30 permanent jobs: maintenance, leasing, security. From a real estate efficiency standpoint, Rebecca was right. The condos generated more revenue per square foot than the factory. From an economic ecosystem standpoint, and she was catastrophically wrong. The factory sustained working-class employment that supported local businesses: restaurants, shops, services. The condos concentrated wealth among people who already had it and who spent their money through apps, not neighborhood stores. The Mission District transformed around the site. Between 2000 and 2015, median household income in the neighborhood increased 81%, from $38,900 to $70,400. But that statistic concealed demographic replacement. Lower-income residents weren't earning more, they were leaving. Latino population declined from 50% to 38%. The percentage of residents working in manufacturing, construction, or service industries dropped from 42% to 28%. Businesses changed too. The corner store on Valencia and 16th Street, where factory workers had bought lunch for 40 years, closed in 2008. It was replaced by an artisanal coffee shop charging $6 for a cappuccino. The taqueria on 17th Street, opened in 1976, closed in 2011. It became a boutique selling $80 t-shirts. The Filipino restaurant on 18th Street, family-owned since 1982, closed in 2013. It became a restaurant serving $24 entrees, described as elevated comfort food. These weren't random changes. They were the predictable result of removing middle-class employment and replacing it with high-income housing. The neighborhood's economy shifted from serving workers to serving wealth, and the workers who'd built that neighborhood couldn't afford to stay in it. Some former Levi's employees remained in the Mission, barely. Maria Gonzalez, who'd worked at Valencia Street for 23 years before the closure and still lived in the neighborhood in 2015, but only because she'd bought her apartment in 1988 under a rent control lease. Her rent was $1,240 monthly for a one-bedroom. Comparable units in her building were renting for $3,800. Maria was 62, working part-time at a Walgreens, earning $12.50 per hour. She couldn't afford to move. Anywhere she relocated would cost more than her current rent-controlled unit. She was trapped in a neighborhood that had become economically hostile to people like her. She walked past Valencia Commons occasionally, but never went inside. "It's strange," she told a reporter in 2015. "I worked in that exact spot for 23 years. I knew every inch of that building. Now I wouldn't be welcome there. Not because anyone would stop me, but because I don't belong. It's for different people now." Different people. That phrase contained multitudes. Valencia Commons residents were overwhelmingly white or Asian, college-educated, working in technology or finance. The Levi's workforce had been overwhelmingly Latino and Asian immigrant women without college degrees, working in manufacturing. These groups didn't overlap. They didn't socialize. They didn't shop at the same stores. They existed in the same geographic space, but occupied entirely separate economic universes. The city celebrated the transformation. Mayor Gavin Newsom attended Valencia Commons' grand opening in November 2008, calling it exactly the kind of development San Francisco needs: density, sustainability, and economic vitality in a transitioning neighborhood. He didn't mention the 2,800 jobs that had been eliminated to make the site available. That was old news. The city had moved on. And it wasn't just Valencia Street. Across the United States, former factory sites were following the same trajectory: industrial closure, demolition, residential or commercial redevelopment for higher income populations. The Cone Denim Mill in North Carolina, which had supplied Levi's for decades, closed in 2003. The site became offices and upscale housing. The Carhartt factory in Kentucky, shuttered in 2006, became a mixed-use development. The Bluebell plant in North Carolina, closed in 2005, became a shopping center. The pattern was universal: eliminate manufacturing, convert to consumption spaces, attract wealthier residents, displace the workers who'd made the area industrial. Economic development officials called this revitalization. Workers called it something else. By 2015, the entire physical infrastructure of American denim manufacturing had essentially vanished. Levi's operated 0 U.S. factories. The last major American-made jeans brand was Roundhouse, a small Oklahoma company producing maybe 100,000 pairs annually using 25 workers, 0.04% of what Valencia Street alone had produced at peak. Some entrepreneurs tried to revive domestic production. In 2012, a Los Angeles startup called All American Clothing began making jeans in North Carolina, marketing them as union-made in the USA. They sold for $128 retail. Volume peaked at 30,000 pairs annually, not enough to be economically sustainable. The company pivoted to military contracts and custom orders. The problem wasn't demand. Surveys consistently showed consumers would pay 20 to 30% premiums for American-made jeans. The problem was infrastructure. The supply chain no longer existed. Denim mills had closed or shifted to industrial fabric. Trim suppliers were gone. Skilled workers had retired. Training new workers required time and capital that small companies couldn't afford. What Levi's had destroyed by closing their factories wasn't just their own capacity. It was the entire ecosystem that made domestic denim production viable for anyone. Suppliers, contractors, and training institutions all depended on large-scale anchor tenants like Levi's. When the anchor disappeared, the ecosystem collapsed, and it couldn't be rebuilt, not economically, not at scale. The knowledge was gone. The workers were gone. The infrastructure was gone. It had been converted to condos. On a spring afternoon in 2016, a man named David Martinez stood outside Valencia Commons looking up at the building. He was 38 years old, worked in construction, lived in Hayward. His mother, Carmen Martinez, had worked at the Levi's factory for 26 years, 1977 to 2003. She'd sewn belt loops, 8 hours a day, 5 belt loops per minute. She'd earned $16.50 per hour when the factory closed. She'd never found comparable work afterward. Carmen died in 2014 at age 68. Heart attack. David believed the stress of her post-Levi's employment instability, 7 different jobs in 11 years, none with health insurance, had contributed to her death. He'd come to Valencia Street because he wanted to see where his mother had spent most of her working life. But there was nothing to see, just glass and steel and young people in expensive athletic wear walking dogs. No memorial, no historical marker, no acknowledgement that anything significant had happened there. David stood there for maybe 10 minutes. Then he walked away. Later, he told a friend, "It's like she never existed, like none of them existed. They worked their whole lives making something people actually needed, and now the place where they worked is for people who will never do that kind of work. It's not that I'm angry. I just don't understand how we decided that was progress. How we decided that was progress. That question, unanswered, maybe unanswerable, hung over the empty space where 2,800 workers once built the jeans that built American denim. The condos were full, the workers were gone, and the distance between those two facts was the entire story of what America had chosen to become. The lesson, corporate America keeps repeating Levi's, wasn't the last company to trade identity for efficiency, and it won't be the last. The pattern has repeated so consistently across American industry that it's become a playbook. Dominant company faces margin pressure. Consultants recommend offshore manufacturing. Executives implement closures. Short-term financials improve. Long-term competitive position erodes. Brand becomes hollow. It happened to Levi's. It happened to dozens of others. It's happening right now. In 2016, Carrier Air Conditioning announced the closure of its Indianapolis factory, eliminating 1,400 jobs and moving production to Monterrey, Mexico. The company cited labor cost differentials, $28 per hour in Indianapolis versus $6 in Mexico. Expected annual savings, $65 million. The decision was financially rational. It was also strategically myopic in ways Carrier wouldn't recognize for years. The Indianapolis factory had produced air conditioning units since 1951. Workers averaged 17 years tenure. They developed specialized knowledge, how to optimize assembly for different climate specifications, how to troubleshoot quality issues before they reached customers, how to adapt production lines for new models without expensive retooling. That knowledge was tacit, embedded in people, not documented in manuals. When production moved to Mexico, that knowledge stayed behind. The new factory struggled with quality control for 18 months. Defect rates spiked. Warranty claims increased 34%. Customer satisfaction scores dropped. By 2019, Carrier's parent company, United Technologies, acknowledged in an annual report that manufacturing transitions have temporarily impacted operational performance. The $65 million in annual savings was partially offset by $40 million in quality-related costs and lost sales. The pattern was identical to Levi's: savings on paper, erosion in practice. Or consider General Electric. Between 2000 and 2015, GE shifted substantial appliance manufacturing from Louisville, Kentucky, to Mexico and China. The logic was clear: reduce costs, improve margins, satisfy shareholders. CEO Jeff Immelt defended the moves repeatedly, telling investors in 2011, "We manufacture where it makes economic sense. Sentimentality doesn't create value." But something unexpected happened. In 2016, GE sold its appliance division to Haier, a Chinese company, for $5.4 billion, roughly half the division's value in 2000. It's what had changed. GE Appliances no longer controlled manufacturing. They'd become a brand management company dependent on contract manufacturers who served multiple clients. Without proprietary production capabilities, the division became a commodity asset worth only its brand recognition, not its manufacturing expertise. Haier immediately announced plans to invest $150 million, expanding the Louisville facility and bringing production back from overseas. Why? Because Haier understood what GE had forgotten. Controlling manufacturing provides strategic flexibility, quality consistency, and the ability to respond rapidly to market changes. These advantages justify higher labor costs when you're building for long-term dominance rather than quarterly earnings. The lesson Levi's, Carrier, and GE all learned too late. Manufacturing isn't just a cost center. It's a strategic asset that creates defensible competitive advantages. Institutional knowledge, quality control, supply chain resilience, rapid iteration. When you outsource manufacturing, you're not just reducing costs. You're transferring strategic capability to contractors whose interests don't align with yours. But here's why companies keep making this mistake. The benefits of offshore manufacturing appear immediately in financial statements: lower costs, higher margins, improved earnings per share. The costs appear gradually: quality erosion, brand dilution, loss of innovation capability, competitive vulnerability. By the time the costs become obvious, the executives who made the decision have moved on. Philip Marineau closed Levi's factories in 2002. He collected performance bonuses, left in 2006, and became a well-compensated board member at multiple companies. The consequences of his decisions emerged years later, affecting workers, shareholders, and subsequent executives. He faced no accountability for the long-term damage because corporate governance measures executives on short-term results. This misalignment between decision timelines and consequence timelines is structural. Public companies optimize for quarterly performance. Private equity optimizes for 3 to 5 year exits. Executives optimize for their tenure. None of these timeframes align with the decade-plus horizons required to build and maintain competitive advantages through manufacturing excellence. And yet the pattern continues. In 2018, Harley-Davidson announced plans to shift some production from Pennsylvania to Thailand to avoid European tariffs and reduce costs. Workers at the York, Pennsylvania plant, which had produced motorcycles since 1973, protested. They argued that Harley's brand was inseparable from American manufacturing, that customers bought Harleys specifically because they were made in America by American workers. They were right. Market research consistently showed that Harley's premium pricing, $15,000 to $40,000 per motorcycle, was justified primarily by American-made authenticity. Harley wasn't competing on performance or innovation. They were selling identity. Manufacturing location was the product. But Harley moved production anyway, citing unavoidable economic pressure. Within 2 years, sales declined 11%. Brand perception studies showed sharp drops in authenticity ratings. By 2020, Harley was struggling to attract younger buyers who saw the brand as trading its heritage for cost savings. The parallels to Levi's were exact. Dominant heritage brand, premium positioning justified by American manufacturing story, decision to offshore production for margin improvement, immediate financial benefit, delayed brand erosion, long-term competitive decline. It's happening in automotive. Between 2000 and 2020, the number of auto parts manufacturing facilities in the United States declined 34%, from approximately 5,500 to 3,600. Production shifted to Mexico, China, and Eastern Europe. American automakers celebrated reduced costs. Then came 2021, when supply chain disruptions exposed the vulnerability of depending on globally dispersed contractors. Chip shortages, shipping delays, and quality inconsistencies cost American automakers an estimated $210 billion in lost production. Companies that had maintained more vertical integration, notably Toyota, weathered the crisis better. It's happening in technology. Apple manufactures almost nothing in-house, relying on Chinese contractors like Foxconn for iPhone assembly. This strategy enabled massive scale and margins, but it also made Apple vulnerable. When COVID-19 shut down Chinese factories in 2020, iPhone production stopped. Apple couldn't pivot to alternative manufacturers quickly because Foxconn possessed specialized knowledge and infrastructure that couldn't be replicated rapidly. Apple began acknowledging this vulnerability, announcing in 2022 plans to diversify manufacturing to India and Vietnam, essentially rebuilding the redundancy they'd eliminated to maximize efficiency. The pattern extends beyond manufacturing. Boeing outsourced substantial engineering work for the 787 Dreamliner to contractors in Japan, Italy, and South Carolina. The cost savings were significant, but coordination failures, quality issues, and integration problems delayed the 787 program by 3 years and cost roughly $32 billion in overruns. Boeing had hollowed out its engineering expertise in pursuit of efficiency, then discovered that designing complex aircraft requires institutional knowledge that contractors don't possess. Why does this keep happening? Because the logic is always locally rational. Each individual decision, close this factory, outsource this component, shift production offshore, makes financial sense in isolation. The accumulated effect of many rational decisions is competitive collapse. But no single executive bears responsibility for the accumulated effect. They're evaluated on individual decisions, and the workers pay the price. Between 2000 and 2020, the United States lost approximately 5 million manufacturing jobs, roughly 30% of the total manufacturing workforce. Not all of these losses came from offshoring. Automation, productivity improvements, and demand shifts contributed. But studies estimate that 40 to 60% of manufacturing job losses resulted from companies choosing to produce elsewhere. Those workers didn't transition smoothly to new careers. A 2019 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research tracked workers displaced from manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2015. The findings mirrored what happened to Levi's workers. Average earnings decline of 28% for workers who found new employment within 2 years. 35% experienced unemployment lasting longer than 6 months. Displaced workers from closed factories were 68% more likely to file for disability within 5 years. Communities with major factory closures saw increases in opioid addiction rates, suicide rates, and overall mortality. These weren't abstract economic transitions. These were human catastrophes that could have been avoided by companies willing to accept slightly lower margins in exchange for stable employment and community health. But corporate decision-making doesn't internalize those costs. When Levi's closed Valencia Street, they recorded a one-time restructuring charge of $48 million. They didn't record the $200+ million in lifetime earnings losses experienced by displaced workers. They didn't record the increased social service costs to San Francisco. They didn't record the destruction of institutional knowledge worth potentially billions. Those costs were real. They just weren't on Levi's books. This is the fundamental flaw in how American capitalism currently operates. We've defined corporate success so narrowly, shareholder value, quarterly earnings, stock price, that we've excluded the actual consequences of corporate decisions on workers, communities, and long-term competitiveness. Companies optimize for metrics that ignore most of what matters. And until that changes, the pattern will repeat. Another company will face margin pressure. Consultants will recommend offshoring. Executives will approve closures. Short-term financials will improve. Long-term competitive position will erode. Workers will be displaced. Communities will decline, just like Levi's, just like Carrier, just like GE, just like all the others. The lesson isn't that offshore manufacturing is always wrong. It's that treating manufacturing as purely a cost to minimize, rather than as a strategic capability to nurture, is a mistake companies keep making, because the people making the decisions don't bear the consequences. And somewhere, right now, an executive is looking at a factory that's been operating for decades, employing thousands, producing products people trust. They're looking at a spreadsheet showing that closing it would save money. And they're making the same decision Philip Marineau made in 2002. They believe they have no choice. They believe it's just business. They believe the factory is a cost, not an asset. They're about to learn the same lesson Levi's learned. Some costs are invisible until you've already paid them. And some assets are irreplaceable once you've destroyed them. But by the time they learn it, they'll be gone. And the workers will remain, dealing with consequences no one calculated. And what still sticks. Every pair of Levi's still carries a story, but not the one that built them. Walk into any department store in 2024 and you'll find Levi's jeans. 501 Oz, still button fly, still 5 pockets, still copper rivets. They retail for $59.50 to $98 depending on wash and cut. They look like what your grandfather wore. The label still features the iconic 2-horse logo, 2 horses failing to tear apart a pair of jeans, symbolizing durability. But turn the jeans over. Check the label inside the waistband. It says, made in Bangladesh, or made in Cambodia, or made in Vietnam, or made in Sri Lanka. It doesn't say made in San Francisco, USA, because that hasn't been true for 22 years. The jeans are fine. They're acceptable. They last maybe 2 years with regular wear. Less than the 5 years a 1970s pair lasted, but comparable to most modern denim. The quality issues that plagued Levi's in the mid-2000s have mostly been resolved through better contractor management and quality control systems. These are competent jeans made by competent factories serving competent supply chains, but they're not what they were, and everyone knows it. even if they can't articulate exactly what changed. Levi Strauss and Company is still operating. Revenue in 2023 reached $6.2 billion, up 51% from the $4.1 billion in 2007, and the low point after factory closures. The company went public again in 2019, raising $623 million at a $6.6 billion valuation. Wall Street considered it a successful IPO. The stock currently trades at reasonable multiples. By conventional business metrics, Levi's has recovered. But look closer at the revenue composition. In 2002, before factory closures, Levi's generated 84% of revenue from wholesale, selling to retailers like Macy's, Nordstrom, and JCPenney. In 2023, wholesale represents only 62% of revenue. The growth came from direct-to-consumer channels, company-owned stores, and e-commerce. Levi's had to backward integrate into retail because they'd lost wholesale pricing power. Retailers could source comparable denim from contractors for less. The Levi's premium had evaporated. The brand ranking tells the story more clearly. In 2000, Levi's was the #3 most valuable apparel brand globally, behind only Nike and Adidas. In 2023, Levi's ranked number 18, below Zara, H&M, Uniqlo, Lululemon, and Supreme, brands that didn't exist or were regional players when Levi's closed Valencia Street. The company hadn't collapsed. It had been surpassed by competitors who never tried to compete on heritage because heritage had become irrelevant. What Levi's lost, what they can't rebuild, is the thing that made them defensible for 130 years: authenticity. Not marketing authenticity, but actual authenticity, correspondence between brand story and brand reality. For a century, Levi's could legitimately claim, "These jeans are made by American workers using techniques we've perfected over generations. We control every aspect of production." When you buy Levi's, and you're buying institutional knowledge and manufacturing excellence. That claim justified premium prices. It created emotional loyalty. It made the brand meaningful beyond function. That claim is no longer available. Levi's now says, "We design jeans and have them manufactured by contractors we monitor for quality and labor standards." That's a fine claim. It's what most apparel brands say. But it doesn't differentiate. It doesn't create loyalty. It doesn't justify premiums. Some companies have recognized this and attempted to rebuild manufacturing-based authenticity. New Balance produces approximately 25% of its athletic shoes in U.S. factories, Massachusetts and Maine. They market these shoes at $50 to $80 premiums over comparable imported models. Sales of U.S.-made New Balance shoes have grown 40% since 2015. Consumers willing to pay for authenticity exist. But rebuilding domestic manufacturing requires patient capital and long timelines that most companies won't commit to. Levi's explored bringing some production back. In 2019, CEO Chip Bergh mentioned in an earnings call that the company was evaluating opportunities for limited U.S. production of premium products. Nothing materialized. The infrastructure was gone. Training workers would take years. Capital investment would be enormous. And the financial returns, even with premium pricing, couldn't justify the costs given current debt levels and shareholder expectations. So Levi's has pursued a different strategy: manufacturing nostalgia. The brand has released multiple heritage collections, vintage-style 501s retailing for $148 to $218, and marketed with archival photographs and stories about the Valencia Street factory. These collections sell modestly, maybe 5% of total volume. They're profitable, but they're also fundamentally dishonest. They're selling a manufacturing story while manufacturing nothing. They're monetizing history they've abandoned. It's the retail equivalent of cosplay, dressing up as your former self without actually being that self. And consumers are increasingly skeptical. Online reviews of Levi's heritage collections are consistently cynical. A typical comment from a Reddit thread in 2023: they want $180 for jeans made in the same Cambodian factory as the $60 pair, just because they slapped a vintage label on them and showed some pictures of when they actually made jeans in America. It's insulting. That word, insulting, captures the problem. When you trade on heritage you've voluntarily destroyed, people notice. They might still buy the product, but they don't respect the brand. And without respect, there's no premium. There's no loyalty. There's just comparative shopping. The workers know this better than anyone. In 2023, a group of former Valencia Street employees, now mostly in their 70s and 80s, organized a reunion. 47 people attended, gathering at a community center in Daly City. They hadn't worked together in 20 years. Many had barely survived economically. But they wanted to see each other, to acknowledge what they'd built together. A journalist from KQED attended and asked them what they thought about Levi's success since the closure. One woman, Teresa Flores, who'd worked at Valencia Street for 32 years, said, "I'm glad they're still in business. I wore Levi's my whole life." But they're not the same company. That company cared about making good jeans and treating workers right. This company cares about making money. I understand why that's business today. But don't tell me it's the same. Teresa was right. It's not the same. And here's what makes the Levi's story so instructive. The transformation wasn't inevitable. It was chosen. Levi's faced real competitive pressure in the 1990s and early 2000s. Margins were compressing. Foreign manufacturers had cost advantages. Fashion was fragmenting. These were genuine challenges requiring strategic responses. But closing all U.S. manufacturing wasn't the only response available. Levi's could have maintained flagship domestic production for premium lines while shifting commodity products offshore, preserving authenticity where it mattered most. They could have invested in automation that reduced labor costs while keeping manufacturing in-house. They could have accepted lower margins temporarily, betting that brand strength would eventually justify premiums. They could have stayed private longer, avoiding quarterly earnings pressure. Instead, they chose the path that maximized short-term financial metrics at the expense of long-term strategic position. And 22 years later, they're still living with that choice. Not catastrophically, the company survives, generates revenue, employs people, but diminished, hollowed out, generic. The broader lesson extends beyond Levi's. It's about what we choose to value in economic life. Do we value efficiency above all, squeezing costs, maximizing margins, optimizing shareholder returns? Or do we value resilience, institutional knowledge, community stability, and the intangible assets that create genuine competitive advantages? American capitalism in the early 21st century chose efficiency, repeatedly, systematically, across industry after industry. The results are visible. Manufacturing employment down 30%, communities devastated, brands hollowed out, supply chains vulnerable, institutional knowledge lost. The efficiency gains were real. Corporations did reduce costs. Shareholders did receive returns. Executives did earn bonuses. The system worked exactly as designed, for the people who owned the system. But for the workers who built products, for the communities that housed factories, for the brands that traded heritage for margins, the results were catastrophic. And those catastrophes don't appear on any corporate balance sheet. They appear as disability claims, opioid deaths, abandoned houses, and grandchildren who'll never know their grandparents worked for a company that made something people trusted. In San Francisco today, Valencia Street looks nothing like it did when Levi's operated there. The condos are occupied. The tech workers are thriving. The neighborhood is expensive, trendy, and utterly disconnected from the industrial history that made it significant. There's no memorial to the 2,800 workers who spent decades on that site. No historical marker explaining what happened there. The city's official history of the Mission District mentions the Levi's factory in 2 sentences, treating it as a minor footnote in the neighborhood's evolution toward its current status as a high-rent creative district. The erasure is complete. Not just physical, the building is gone, but historical. The workers, their labor, their knowledge, their contributions to building one of America's most iconic brands have been edited out of the story. What remains is marketing, vintage photographs in flagship stores, heritage collections trading on nostalgia, corporate communications about 170 years of denim innovation. But ask where that innovation happens now, and the answer is nowhere. Levi's doesn't innovate manufacturing processes. They don't own manufacturing. They don't develop proprietary fabric treatments. They buy from the same mills as competitors. They don't train workers in specialized techniques. They negotiate with contractors who serve multiple brands. They design, they market, they manage supply chains. These are valuable activities, but they're not what made Levi's for 130 years. What made Levi's was jeans made by people who knew denim, who cared about quality, who took pride in craft, and who built that pride in a specific place over multiple generations. That place is gone. Those people are scattered. That knowledge is retired or dead. And what remains is a logo on jeans made by the same contractors making jeans for a dozen other brands. So when you ask what still sticks about Levi's, what survived the factory closures, the answer is less than the company wants to believe, off more than they want to admit. The brand name sticks. The product design sticks. The historical recognition sticks. But the meaning is gone. The authenticity is gone. The defensible competitive advantage is gone. And in the space where a factory once stood, where sewing machines once roared, and workers once stitched millions of identical arcs believing that sameness meant security, there are now glass towers and granite countertops and people who will never do that kind of work, living in a building whose very existence proves that what they replaced was worth less than the rent they pay. That's the real story of Levi's, not rise and fall, not decline and resurrection, but transformation from a company that made something meaningful into a company that manages the intellectual property of having once made something meaningful. The jeans are still blue. They still have rivets. They still say Levi's. But when you remove the people who made them, when you erase the place where they were built, when you sacrifice craft for capital and authenticity for efficiency, what exactly remains of a brand? The answer is in every pair of jeans labeled "Made in Bangladesh" that sells for $98 while trading on photographs of San Francisco workers who earned $17 an hour and lost everything when the spreadsheet said they cost too much. What remains is a question that can't be answered with revenue figures or stock prices or market share data. What remains is a ghost. the shape of something that used to be real, now hollowed out and repurposed, visible only to people who remember when it was more than a logo. And that ghost haunts every quarterly earnings call, and every heritage collection launch, every corporate communication about values and legacy and commitment to quality. Because everyone knows. The executives know. The workers knew. The consumers suspect. You can't remove the soul of something and expect the body to live forever. Eventually, everyone figures out what's missing, and by then, it's too late to get it back.